Hey everyone! So today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Cultural Evolution. So we've been talking about this culture and psyche dynamic a lot. Remember, it is the mutual constitution of culture and psyche. It's that culture shapes its cultural members, but the cultural members aren't just passive sponges, they're actually active shapers of themselves and the world. So, people living within a cultural context are going to live their daily lives, and by living their daily lives, by feeling certain emotions, thinking about things in certain ways, behaving in certain manners, they actively reinforce or reconstruct culture. Okay, so this is an active dynamic cycle, and it makes sure that cultures are fluid and dynamic and can persist and also change over time. Okay, so continuing on, let's talk about cultural evolution. So, how exactly is culture passed on and how exactly does it change? So we have some themes for this chapter, and we're going to start with the first theme of why is there cultural variation? Does this cultural variation come from ecology or does it come from somewhere else? Okay. All right. So the first theme is cultural variation comes from ecology, but it doesn't always have to. So what this means is that there are characteristics of the ecology and geography around us that impact our cultural practices. We've already talked about some of these in our previous examples. So we looked at chimpanzee tool use. So recall that different regions, chimps living in different regions, have different types of cultural practices. So if a chimp is living in an area that has a lot of ants and termites, they might resort or engage in more practices like termite and ant fishing. This one here is doing stick fishing here for termites. If the chimp is living in a region where there's lots of nuts, they may have to engage in cultural practices such as nut cracking. This one is using a log to crack open a seed or a nut. You can see that there. Okay. In human examples, we talked about the culture of honor. So in this case, the ecology was sort of, well, the ecological pressures was sort of that people were engaging in different economic practices. So there was herding versus agriculture, and more of the herding practices in the South eventually led to the emphasis on protecting your honor. So that's where the culture of honor hypothesis comes from. Okay. So we want to have another example to illustrate this point. So this example, again, is not an empirical example, but it's an example that really clearly illustrates different ways in which culture can be transmitted, and different cultures might differ from each other. Okay, so I want you all to pause the video, well, this lecture video right here, and transition into watching this YouTube clip about Jared Diamond's argument. And his argument is asking this question: why did development proceed at such different rates on different continents? Okay, so here Diamond is examining the differences between the Spaniards and the Incans and why the Spaniards were able to defeat the Incans so drastically. Okay, so this is a relatively long YouTube video, so if you don't have time to watch the entire thing, I've sort of summarized some select clips that you can look at here. So watch those clips and try to answer this question that I have in red here. Okay, so by now you should have watched the video or the select clips that I outlined for you and have a list of reasons for why development proceeded at different rates from between the Spaniards and the Incans. Okay, so from the list that you have, I want you to categorize them into one of the other. So either as proximal causes, so something that had a direct and immediate effect, or a distal cause, which is an initial difference that didn't lead to a direct effect, but led to effects over long periods of time. Okay, so you might sketch out sort of a timeline map of the most proximal or closest immediate on one end, and then going more distal and longer effects over time on the other end. Okay. And once you've sketched that out, you can meet me in the next slide. All right, so as you saw in the video clip and from what you have probably sketched out by now, Jared Diamond's argument is counteracting this misconception that the Spaniards were somewhat more enlightened or were more intelligent than the Incans. Okay, so he's arguing that that's not the case. In fact, it was probably just pure luck or due to the chance of ecology that the Spaniards were able to defeat the Incans. Okay, so it wasn't that the Spaniards were particularly special. There were these ecological causes that led to the outcome. Okay, so let's walk through the different causes of why the Spaniards were able to defeat the Incans in this way. Okay, and we're gonna again separate them into proximal causes or more distal causes. Okay, so the most proximal cause are the causes that have the most direct effect in the Spaniards defeating the Incans. And as the title of the documentary, which is originally a book, suggests, the most proximal causes were guns, germs, and steel. So the Spaniards had guns and steel. They had this sophisticated technology as well as germs that were directly the cause of them beating the Incans. Okay, so guns and steel are deadly weapons. Germs, also biological weapon, something that the Spaniards had protection to, and the Incans did not have protection to. So these are the proximal and most direct causes. Okay. Next, we have sort of the next level or the next hierarchy of causes. And these are relatively more distal causes because they didn't have a direct effect, but rather they had an effect over time. Okay, so we can organize some of these mid-tier distal causes in terms of agriculture and food, as well as animal domestication. Okay, so the Europeans or the Spaniards were more settled down. They didn't move around. They lived in settled populations. So because they were living in one place and were relatively sedentary, they were able to grow their population and have a large population, large number of people living. Okay. And this was possible because they had agriculture and a lot of food. You can't grow your population if you don't have enough food. Okay. Because they also had agriculture and a lot of food or like stable food source, they were able to have a lot more extra time. So with this extra time that they didn't have to worry about food or moving around, they could develop specialty in crafts and technology, such as creating weapons. And they could also organize themselves in a political manner. Okay. There's also a lot of relationships with other countries, sometimes good, sometimes bad in terms of war. So that also gave them this organizational ability. Okay. There was also animal domestication. So cows and horses were not always native to the area, but they were able to get access to these animals and domesticate them. And domesticating these animals helped with farming. Having cows can help with farming for sure, in terms of manual labor. Animal domestication was also really helpful because living in close proximity with these animals gave them immunity to a lot of diseases. So animals carry different diseases from humans, as we know by now. And being around them often was sort of like getting a flu shot. So they were able to get immune from these diseases. And then, of course, domestication led to horses. So horses are great for war. It gives you a higher point of battle. Horses are also very dangerous if they step on you. So horses were also very helpful. So these factors linked more to agriculture and food and animal domestication are more distal causes because these themselves didn't directly lead to the outcome, but these over time led to the guns, germs, and steel, that might be more proximal. Okay, so as you probably saw from the diamond video, the most distal cause, according to his argument, is that there was this shared east-west axis or shared latitude of Eurasia. Okay, and this really helped the Spaniards get access to the easy to domesticate crops and animal species that led to all of those other distal causes, which ultimately led to those proximal causes that we talked about. So if we look at the shared latitude, this is really important. So this latitude includes the Fertile Crescent, and the Fertile Crescent is thought to be the birthplace of agriculture and the origin of a lot of these species. Okay, so if you have a shared latitude, what does this mean? It generally means that you have the same climate. So an example of this, if we look at the Americas, you can see that it's very not wide across and then very long, okay, in terms of longitude. So in this case, North America and South America are split up, and the climate or the seasons are completely the opposite. So if it's summer in the North Americas, it is winter in the South America area. Okay, so it's much more difficult to share or spread crops and animal species. But if you have shared latitude, the seasons are the same. So it's a lot easier to transplant and share crops and animal species. And these crops and animal species, again, are what led to those other important distal causes that ultimately led to the proximal causes of the Spaniards defeating the Incans. Okay, so these examples that we went over for Jared Diamond's argument seem to be more of these examples of evoked culture. So evoked culture is cultural variation that comes from ecology. So things like cultural practices gained from environmental challenges. So cultural practices that come from having to figure out where to get food, where to get territory, responding to natural disasters, avoiding disease, etc. Okay, sounds kind of similar to what we discussed in terms of gene-culture coevolution. So evoked culture is culture that comes from ecological pressures. Okay, so a lot of cultural examples we've discussed are examples of evoked culture. Okay, so things like culture of honor, again, the chimpanzee tools, a lot of our cultural practices like using fire and wearing thicker clothes could all be thought of as initially an evoked cultural practice. But not all of our cultural practices have to be due to evoked culture. Some can be transmitted. So to the extent that evoked cultural practices are adaptive, they can become culturally entrenched and transmitted as normative. So what this means is that transmitted culture can also exist because cultural practices exist or persist even when the original ecological conditions disappear. So the culture of honor still exists in the southern regions of the South, but we're not actually really hurting anymore, yet this cultural practice still exists. So we can explain this by saying the persistence of the honor cultures is due to transmitted culture or social transmission rather than just being evoked culture right now. So here's another example of how evoked culture could become transmitted, or maybe the boundaries aren't as clear. So don't worry, I won't ask you to guess, is this evoked or transmitted? That wouldn't be really fair. I just want us to think about what might be more evoked, and could this become a transmitted cultural practice? Okay, so this example is looking at the culture of focusing on attractiveness in partners. Okay, so a long time ago, at least in the North American context, this might have been an example of evoked culture. So attractiveness wasn't just about quote unquote beauty, but it was a symbol of health. Okay. So an attractive person might be somebody who didn't have blemishes, for example, which might have meant that they don't have smallpox. Okay. It's not about quote unquote beauty, it was about health. And healthy mates are more likely to have surviving offspring. So we might have had this preference for healthy partners because we want a healthy mate and healthy offspring. So in the past, this would have been an example of evoked culture because this is due to ecological pressures. However, in this current day, we don't really have to worry about smallpox or parasitic infections. Yet this focus on our culture of attractiveness is still persistent. So perhaps in this current day in North America, this is more of transmitted culture that we learn from social messaging. Okay. In other contexts where there are still parasites, as shown here in one study, a researcher looked at 29 different cultural contexts, and they looked at whether parasites were prevalent in that area and the things that people looked at in terms of mates. And what they found was that areas that had a lot of parasites still really valued attractiveness in their mate. Okay, so this suggests that in areas that still have parasites, attractiveness might still be important because attractiveness equals symbol of health. So again, in those regions, the culture of attractiveness in partners might still be evoked culture. Okay, so again, boundaries aren't that clear, and that's okay. Okay, so I have another example here. Well, this one might be a little bit clearer, but this one is evidence of non-evoked culture. So again, evoked culture is about ecological pressures and responding to that. Okay, so here we have the Dinka and the Nuer. Okay, you can see the regions that they occupy mapped out here, red for Dinka, purple for Nuer. And these two groups share the same region. So they live in South Sudan, and the geography is pretty similar. They're marshlands, and they share a lot of similarities. So essentially, you can see that the Nuer live like sort of in the middle of the Dinka. They share similar technology. They have similar crops and animals. So in the wet season, both of them grow corn, and in the dry season, they both raise their cattle. However, there does seem to be a difference in their cultural practices. Okay, and I just have a couple examples here. So, military size. The Nuer have twice as large of a military as the Dinka do, so there's different values of military and protection. Basis for tribal membership, so the Nuer is male line only with kinship, whereas Dinka, their membership is whoever is my neighbor during wet season. Okay, so although both of them, although both of them grow corn and raise cattle, their food is a little bit different. So you can see that the Nuer mostly eat grains and milk, whereas the Dinka primarily eat meat. Also really interesting in terms of dowry, there's a big difference here. So the Nuer have a very strict dowry. You can see that the amount of the dowry is much larger than the Dinka. There's also a minimum, and there's no credit allowed. Okay, so even though these two groups share the same region, some argue that they both come from the same ethnic background. They have very different cultural practices. So this suggests that culture isn't simply evoked, because if it was simply due to ecological pressures, we would see that the Dinka and the Nuer should have really similar identical cultural practices, but they don't. So this is evidence for non-evoked culture. All right. So our second topic is that cultural ideas spread. So this might seem like duh, of course cultural ideas spread, but we're just talking a little bit more in depth about transmitted culture. Okay, so not evoked, we're talking about transmitted culture. So, how do we think that culture spreads? We know that culture spreads from others. Okay, that's why it's transmitted. But what is the theory behind it? So, there are two main arguments. One is the gene or the meme model. Just a quick note here, this meme model is not the same thing as the memes we think about in our current day. So, like the fun cat memes or the silly memes as such. So, these are actually not the memes that I'm talking about when I say gene meme model. Okay. So, the gene meme model is saying that culture is transmitted by replicating exactly each time it's transmitted from person to person to person. Okay. So the simplest examples of like gene meme models are things like jingles, like when people hum the McDonald's jingle or they say the Nike slogan, like just do it. It's never changed. It's exactly the same each time someone does it. Okay. Or sometimes there could be like a really popular like fashion trend. Maybe 15 years ago, there was this huge trend of velour tracksuits. Everybody was wearing them exactly the same without variation. So that would be more of a gene slash meme model of transmission. So this is different than how we're using memes now because it's not the same meme every time. You know, people write different like little blurbs on them. So just note that that's not the same thing. Okay. The other model of transmission is called the epidemiology of ideas model. It's like a really big word for no reason. Essentially, what it's saying is that ideas aren't just copy paste, but ideas change as they're passed along from one brain to another. Okay, so we're not transmitting exactly the same, but we're transmitting things in a biased way. So, for example, like an inventor of an idea comes up with a thought, and then somebody looks at that and they learn the idea from the originator, but they create their own representation. The next person looks at that, they get that idea, and then they create their own mental representation, etc., etc. So that's the epidemiology of ideas model. Okay. So briefly, before we look at some examples of that, I want to talk about how culture spreads. Okay, so how is culture transmitted? It's sort of like biology, but not exactly the same. So let's just quickly run through the similarities and differences between cultural and biological evolution. So, some similarities, like biology, some cultural ideas have higher survival rates than others. So, there are some things biologically that help us survive in this world better. Okay. Um, Same thing goes for culture. So some cultural practices just survive more. And we'll talk about that in the next point. Okay. So some cultural ideas are also prone to being passed along to others. So they're more sticky or they're more catchy, and therefore they'll be passed along more to others. Same thing with biology. So some biological traits are more prone to being passed along to others or being reproduced more. Okay. What are the differences between culture and biology? So, biology takes a long time to be passed down. So, you can't really pass down biology until you have offspring. So, it takes a full generation for biology to be transmitted. On the other hand, cultural ideas can be transmitted horizontally. So, you don't have to wait for the next generation. You can spread it to another person within seconds on Twitter or Instagram. Okay, so cultural evolution is fast. Cultural ideas also don't have to be adaptive. So, a lot of times, biology is based on quote unquote survival of the fittest. So, typically, the biological traits that have more adaptive qualities are going to be the ones that are passed down. But cultural ideas don't necessarily have to be adaptive. So, things that aren't adaptive, like I don't know, internet language, cannibalism, can be passed down, even though they're not necessarily adaptive. Okay. And finally, the difference is that cultural ideas can be intentionally updated. So, of course, biology could be intentionally updated, sort of how people have created designer puppies like Maltipoos. But generally, it's really difficult for us to take control of biology and intentionally update it. On the other hand, cultural ideas can be intentionally updated, and we've talked about this through the mutual constitution of culture and psyche model. So, if enough people living within a context change their behavior over time because people shape the context that they're part of, culture will be updated. Okay, so outline some of the similarities and differences between cultural and biological evolution. Okay, so now let's shift back again to talk about, well, does culture spread through the gene/meme model or the epidemiology model? Okay, and I'll give you an example here. So I'm very sad we can't do this exercise in class because it is very delightful every time I do it. But let's just say that I randomly assign a third of the class to, actually 2/3 of the class to close your eyes and a third of them to open it. You saw this picture? Okay, draw it out on your piece of paper. Okay. All right, and then I'd ask the second group, another third of class participants, to look at what the first group of people drew, draw their version, and then I'd ask the third group of class participants to look at what the second group drew and draw their version. Okay. So let me show you an example of, this isn't from class, but this is from the original research article. So you can see that this initial drawing, which looks very abstract and vague, like, is this an owl, or is this a mask, or is this a person's face? The first person drew it more like this, kind of looks like a surfboard. The next person drew it more like this, so you're starting to see more humanoid features. Next version, next version, next version, next version, next, 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 next. Okay, so what you see here is that as quote unquote ideas or drawings are getting transmitted, and there are, yes, differences in artistic ability, you can still see them becoming less abstract or less weird. It started off with something really vague, and as they're passed down from time to time, they're becoming something closer to what we know and what we're familiar with, which are human faces. Okay, so you might have used your own background knowledge and your own preferences when you were reproducing previous ideas. Okay. Here's another example. So the original looked sort of like this, and then, like, really vague. Is this a cat or an owl or a person, or I'm not really sure. And every iteration, it starts to become a little bit more concrete, a little less abstract, and looking like a cat that we all know. Okay. Finally, to kind of bring this all together, from this point now, you should have made up your mind that I'm trying to tell you culture transmissions operates more through the epidemiology model. That is, it's not copy paste like the gene meme model suggests, but that people are influenced by their own perceptions and their own beliefs, their own preconceived notions when they accept culture and transmit it to the next person. So this study from Imada and Yusin, study 2, I believe, remember that the original story that everybody read from Japan and the US were exactly the same, with an identical number of individualistic and collectivistic elements. And as these stories were passed on from person to person to person, the stories for Japanese participants ended up retaining more collectivistic components than individualistic. So it became a relatively collectivistic story. And the story that from the US participants' perspective retained more individualistic components, so ended up becoming more of an individualistic story. So the information or the story became more and more consistent with the predominant cultural values as it was spread from person to person, and it became something more familiar at the end. So this should give us empirical evidence that cultural transmission operates more at the epidemiology model.